Chapter 15. A Hot Island. General Eisenhower, who was a likable fellow, wrote in his diary in March 1942, "One thing that might help win this war is to get someone to shoot King." He was kidding. The King he was talking about was Admiral King. They disagreed on strategy. Do you think wars are easy to plan? Do you think the leaders all agree on how to go about it? Not often. Most of our military leaders believed that we should fight the war in Europe first and then the war in the Pacific. That made sense. Splitting your fighting forces is never a good idea. Besides, we didn't have enough supplies for two regions. But Admiral King said we just couldn't sit back and let the Japanese take over the Pacific. If we did, they would become so powerful that it would be almost impossible to win the war against them. When the Japanese started building an airfield on an obscure island in the Solomon Island chain, Admiral King said that the United States needed to go on the offensive. So far, in Europe and the Pacific, we had been defensive fighters. King insisted that we take that island from the Japanese. It was an important decision. Not everyone agreed with it. It would cost many lives, American and Japanese. It turned out to be a decision that helped win the war. The obscure island was named Guadalcanal, and it was such an out-of-the-way place that no one even had a map of it. But it was the right spot for a war base. Find Australia on a map, and then look north to New Guinea. To the east of New Guinea are the Solomon Islands. Guadalcanal is one of the southernmost of the Solomons. Anyone who has an air base on Guadalcanal can make big trouble for ships and airplanes going to Australia, New Zealand, or even Japan, which was where the American military planned to go eventually. We couldn't let Japanese put planes on that island. From the air, Guadalcanal looks like a heavenly place, very green, with high mountains, thick forests, sandy beaches, and coconut palms. But Guadalcanal is intensely hot. Note the nearness of the equator. Its jungles are filled with monster leeches, huge scorpions, poisonous centipedes, giant ants, writhing snakes, sculling rats, snapping crocodiles, and hungry anopheles, mosquitoes, whose bites bring malaria. Most of Guadalcanal is tropical rainforest, steamy, thick, muddy jungle. Where there isn't rainforest, there's kuni, grass with stiff sawtooth blades, often 7 feet high, that can leave your arms and legs a mess of cuts. On Guadalcanal, you can't even see the enemy hiding in the grass or behind those jungle trees. The 1st Marine Division landed in August 1942. Marines are trained to fight on land or sea. The 1st Marine Division was specially trained and tough. They needed that toughness. Guadalcanal was one of the hardest fought battles in history. It went on for 6 months. It combined jungle fighting with terrible sea and air battles. At first, things seemed easy. The Marines surprised the Japanese on the island, who were mostly construction crews building an airfield. The Marines captured the airfield. They named it Henderson Field, after a pilot who had been killed at Midway Island. To tell the story of what happened next would take a whole book. Here is some of it. Let's begin with the military word for a mistake. It is snafu, a combination of letters for situation normal, all fouled up. It means that someone goofed. Who goofed on Guadalcanal? Both sides. The pressure and fear of battle often lead to mistakes. One captain, unloading Marines onto the beach, didn't want to risk a Japanese attack on his ships, so he pulled out before the loading was finished, taking supplies and U.S. Marines with him. He stranded the Marines already on the island. That was just one of the goofs. The Japanese officers matched our snafus. They were too sure of themselves. They kept sending small forces to Guadalcanal. They thought Japanese fighters were unbeatable. They thought Americans were not good fighters. They were wrong. In 6 months, the Marines and the Army units that came to fight with them lost 1,598 men on Guadalcanal. Japanese war records show an incredible 23,800 deaths. Many Japanese deaths came in suicidal charges. Surrender was considered shameful. The Japanese also suffered many deaths from tropical disease. Our medical care was much better. Most of the battle for Guadalcanal was fought at sea. Each side lost 24 big ships and many smaller ones. About 20,000 American and Japanese sailors went down there with their ships. The first of the sea fights off nearby Savo Island was the worst disaster in the United States naval history. We were whipped. After that, it was a seesaw of conflict. The battle on the islands were ferocious. The Japanese were a brave foe. They had not lost a war in 400 years, but the Marines outfought them. They held Guadalcanal. The Marines ended the myth that the Japanese were invincible. Guadalcanal was the turning point in the war. We went from defense to offense. The Japanese went from offense to defense. A captured Japanese document said, Guadalcanal Island is the fork in the road which leads to victory for them or us. We took the right road. It would lead to Japan.